think it holds up pretty well.
Yeah, I think so.
So I think that film was in New York Film Festival, which, by the way, congrats on a wonderful lineup for this year. But I think this was in the festival the first year you were on the programming committee.
That is correct, 2009, yeah.
So yeah, what do you recall about seeing it at that time and the selection process?
Yeah, I was, as you said, the first year I was on the committee, and I saw this film in Cannes, and I remember it was one of the films that I made a case for, along with several others in that lineup. Yeah, and that was an interesting lineup. I just actually went back and looked at it and sent you the lineup, and also sent you some responses to it.
Right, there was a oddly kind of critical take by Scott in the New York Times.
Extremely negative,
right.
Possibly the most negative review of a New York Film Festival ever, was that it was occasioned by, not this film specifically, but by that slate seeming to be too difficult, too challenging.
Right, films like Antichrist and The White Ribbon.
Yeah, or like depressing, you know, or just Tony Scott used the word festivalism to describe what he thought was a certain kind of film that film festivals, gravitated towards. And I disagree with a lot about that piece, but you know, I think there was there's one line in there that I think is actually true, which he says that, you know, the people who picked the films for this festival, and he named us all, actually. He did. And he, you know, even like with all these caveats of some of my best friends are critics, and these are some of my favorite critics. But, and then he said that we were acting more like critics than as programmers, than as curators in coming up with this selection. And I think he's right. I think in my first year on the New York Film Festival committee, I wasn't in charge of the committee, but I had an agenda. I had films I wanted to get in. This was one of them. I remember the other film that I really pushed for was Pedro Costa's Ne change rien, which, you know, it was a film that also premiered in Cannes. It was his collaboration with the actress and singer Jean Balibar. Not maybe Pedro's greatest work, but I remember thinking that it was absurd that the festival had ignored Colossal Youth and In Vanda's Room, and it was time to include this filmmaker. And I also thought that Raya was a filmmaker who was at the time 25, had already made like 4 or 5 features, just seemed like a very different kind of filmmaker than was typically welcomed into this pantheon of the New York Film Festival. So yeah, I pushed for him, and you know, I think it was also an interesting group of people. Jim Hoberman and Melissa Anderson, who are friends and colleagues, were on the committee with me. So I think, you know, we sort of made a case for certain films. But yeah, I'm not sure that I would have done that or done it that way if I was more of a curator at the time. Yeah.
And yeah, we'll get more into that transition and, you know, the roles of critic and curator. But it's an interesting critique in part because it seems to me this is part of what makes the New York Film Festival unique and special. Part of its identity is that the people on the selection committee have always been critics.
Yeah, it's been a mix, and I think right now we have a couple of people who are more critics than programmers, and then we have 2 programmers, and then there's me. So.
I want to talk more about the New York Film Festival, but first rewind and ask if you could just tell us a bit about where you grew up and how you came to film originally, how it entered your life.
I was born in Malaysia, which is actually one reason why I wanted to pick. I wanted Southeast Asian cinema to be represented in today's program, as I told you. And I came to film, I guess, in the late 80s as a teenager through VHS copies of, I don't know, films that were. I came to like many people in in the region and at the time, piracy was actually quite an important quite an important thing. I studied in London and I studied in New York, which were great cities for movie going, and I think that's when I guess I became what you might call a cinephile.
But you didn't study film, you studied
I didn't study
mathematics.
film. When I was at NYU, I did take a few film classes, but I've never studied film.
At what point did that transition to film as a career begin to happen? Did you just start writing about film as a cinephile?
Yeah. I studied mathematics as an undergraduate, but found myself often just writing, freelancing for a student publication and then newspapers and magazines, really just as a way to get access to stuff, you know.
Do you remember what your first bylines were? What publications?
I wrote for the University of London's newspaper when I was in London, and then I sent some stuff around, and the Independent, which was a daily newspaper, asked me to review a few films, and also was writing actually about music and about books at the time. It wasn't, I was definitely interested in film, but I was interested in a lot of things, and never really seriously thought that that film criticism was necessarily the thing I would do. But in New York, I studied at NYU, and I did a master's in cultural reporting and criticism, a program that still exists, and was started by Ellen Willis, who was a great critic, a great feminist critic, the New Yorker's first rock critic, somebody I was lucky to study with, and when I was a student, got an internship at the Village Voice, started writing for them, a job opened up. That was it. So.
And what were those early years like at the Village Voice that you were there?
That was kind of a dream job, to be honest, just because my film education, a lot of it came from reading The Voice. Jim Hoberman was a really important figure for me, and I think to be able to go from reading Jim to editing him was important. I mean, the Voice, was still, I think, quite a vibrant publication at that time. This was the late 90s. Or at least we were trying. We were doing our best. It was already a free weekly. I think it's even at the time it seemed like it was past its heyday. Everybody was saying it's not what it used to be. But I think Jim was still writing weekly. And it was also through Jim and through reading him that I discovered other writers who were important to me. I think a lot of people who just. It was through Jim that I think I discovered other alternative weekly critics like Jonathan Rosenbaum and Dave Kerr. Dave Kerr, who's at MoMA now. And I think through their writing, also eventually found Manny Farber. Had to read a lot of Pauline Kael at NYU, and yeah, not as. not as important a figure for me. Although I feel like I know that work so well, and every time I go back to it, I'm like, I just don't get it.
What stood out to you at the time as hallmarks of good or intelligent criticism?
That's such a difficult question.
Or were there pieces or conversations around certain movies or certain trends that inspired the way you were thinking about film at that time?
I think, somebody like Hoberman, just through reading him and through working with him, you just understood that it was always possible to read a film politically. That was important. I think the way he could really look at a scene, do close readings of a film, really evoke a film, but also have historical and political context that was important. I think what was great about working at The Voice was just the fact that we had to eventually, within 2 years of writing for them, I became the film editor, which was also like a very fortuitous thing, and it was a really fun period, actually, just being able to figure out how to cover cinema in the city, and I remember we would go between like Jim always leading the section, but he would start with like reviewing like a big block, but like a Star Wars movie one week, and then like Ken Jacobs the next week, and I think that was actually fun to point to the different ways one could approach film in a place like New York at the time.
What was cinema going like in the city at that time compared to now?
Actually, it was, I think people like to look back on like bygone eras and point and think of them as golden ages. I don't know that it was that great, actually. I think there would be. I remember really important retrospectives that I went to, like Ho Xiaoxian at Lincoln Center, Bresson at MoMA, Fassbinder at MoMA, things like that were really important for me. But I actually think the city right now is I think movie-going in New York is really, really exciting these days. I think people are spoiled for choice, and I think it's healthier now than it was 20, 25 years ago. People forget. I just think there were a lot of gaps. A lot of things would fall through the cracks. Yeah.
And as you were working as an editor and as a critic, did the thought of programming begin to enter your mind?
Yeah, and I think it was actually because of this. I was actually invited to program by my colleague Florence Almozini, who I still work with at Lincoln Center. But she was, one of the founding programmers at BAM when they opened their cinemas. She had read me and some others in The Voice, and she invited me in 2000 to work on an annual series with her. We had just done like this critics poll, for the best films of the year and the best films of the decade. It was the 1999, 2000. So we did that, but I think eventually we developed this annual series where Florence and I would just show films without distribution, films that hadn't been picked up for the U.S. and that we would show in those early years Apichatpong Weerasethakul, Bellatar, Pedro Costa, Sang-soo. These films would just like not be released. Some of them would not be selected by the New York Film Festival. We were often doing New York premieres of those films.
Yeah, you named, I think, two filmmakers who I know to be really important to you. I mean, maybe all, but I'm thinking particularly about Apichatpong and Sang-soo, who you wrote a book about. Can you talk about, your first encounters with those two?
Apichatpong I discovered through his first film. I was, lucky enough to participate in a young critics program at the Rotterdam Film Festival. I think it was the inaugural edition of that, where they invited critics under 30 to go and like write for their daily newspaper. And that was the year Mysterious Object at Noon was there. And we brought it to BAM because of that. And yeah, Apichatpong, to come back to this question of, I was interested, maybe just to tie into what we've just seen, I was interested in Southeast Asian cinema of that period. Southeast Asia being a sort of marginal region that was always eclipsed by South Asia and East Asia, and by the much richer and more developed industries of India and China and Japan and Korea. And obviously many of those countries did have film industries through the 20th century, ups and downs, and sporadically, and in some cases not as developed, and also many films, of course, have been lost over the years. But there seemed to be, in the first decade of the century, the 2000s, really robust activity in the region. Part of it was digital. Obviously, Raya's film, this one is not, and not everybody was working on digital. But there was really something happening, and a lot of the films coming from that part of the world seemed to be engaging with the complicated histories, complicated like national histories, and these very entangled histories and forms of colonialism that were present in the region. And Apichatpong, yeah, to say a bit about the anthem, he made this, I don't remember, 2006, something like that. And it's his response to this law, which still exists in Thailand, that the royal anthem be played before every movie screening. And so he made his own version of it. And I think when he made this film, it was still a punishable offense to not stand when the royal anthem was played. And yeah, I love this. I really love this film. I think it's like one of my favorite short films ever.
Yeah, and speaks to his, I think, enthusiasm and love for cinema as a filmmaker, which is not true of all filmmakers, but I think there are those who, even though he says now that he doesn't watch movies anymore, I think a deep love of cinema informs his work, especially early on.
Yeah, and I think also he has this very intuitive understanding of form. I think he's somebody who can he can make something for a gallery, he can make a VR piece, he can make a feature film, he can make a short film, and he understands exactly what to do with that form, what the limitations are. I feel like he's somebody who's made dozens and dozens of short films. I mean, you programmed them, and like they're amazing. I think most short films are terrible. Like
right.
Most,
yeah.
And I was actually trying to figure out why. I was talking to a friend who teaches and was trying to assign like short films to students, and I think it's something to do with like his films are always about like just opening up possibilities. You think of narrative as like basically like, as a narrative progresses, the number of possibilities that are available to you like diminish by definition. Like the film tapers to a point, but like Apichatpong's films open up always. Even in the 3-minute film, it's just incredible what he does. So I would, in an ideal world, I would bless the theater with this film at every screening.
I would go along with that. Yeah, I think it's the short film thing is interesting. As you said, narrative can be constricting at times, particularly when a lot of young filmmakers, they want to make narrative short films as proof of concepts for feature films, or to try and do the same thing you do in a feature film in a short, which is impossible and ill-advised.
Yeah, I think all the the traps that a lot of narrative filmmakers fall into are just like even more apparent in short form. They're just more like compressed, and yeah.
And then, how about Sang-soo? How were you introduced to his work? I thought it was notable that I'm blanking on the film, but in 2009, your first year on the committee, he did not make the cut for NYFF, but now is a hallmark.
It's true.
Every year.
Yeah, you're right. And that was quite a good one. It was like You Know It All, right. one of his films set at a film festival. I don't remember the particulars. I think there might have been somebody on the committee who wasn't into it, and the fact that at that point Hong had become a bit of a regular, but since then we've shown almost all his films. I discovered Hong. I don't actually remember the first film I saw. It might actually have been at the New York Film Festival. It might have been Turning Gate. And then I remember Florence did a sort of an early retrospective at BAM and showed all the early ones, and I remember seeing them, almost all of them there. Yeah.
I started with later Hong, and I think like many people was turned off at first by the kind of alienating production values or this slightly distancing effect you get from its roughness, but something happened by the third film I watched, which was In Our Day, and by reading your book, Tale of Cinema, a monograph on, which is I think really one of the only times that like a work of criticism has just 180'd me on a filmmaker. And I think you do an extraordinary job on that book and exploring what he excels at, which is largely thinking about the idea and the essence of narrative and turning on its head in so many ways. So I'm curious what your process of writing that book was like.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I really had. I wrote the book to figure out what I really thought of Hong, and I think that's how I sort of enter into writing. I'm not the kind of writer who really knows ahead of time. I may have a strong visceral reaction, positive or negative, to something, but I often don't know why. And I think writing is always a process of figuring out. So Hong was somebody who intrigued me. It was very clear he was doing interesting things with narrative and form. But I think it was just through the process of obsessively rewatching the films and taking notes. That took much longer than the writing. I mean, it was a couple of years of just, and reading around the subject and thinking about like certain motifs that seemed relevant to Hong for me, like repetition, and the idea of like what the low production values that you talked about, like just the economics of filmmaking and how his economic model informs his cinema, and the question of personal filmmaking and auto-fictional filmmaking. I mean, there's a lot of things that Hong just presents for me as like a subject. So I think it was just thinking about all of that and then, yeah, eventually writing the book. I mean, I think the films seem so modest and so, throwaway, and I think they're really rich objects.
When you're writing criticism, particularly a large project like that, are you interested in what other critics are writing about these filmmakers as well, or do you try to take a more purely textual approach?
I am. I mean, I think it's, especially if you're like writing like a book or even an essay like years after the fact, I think the discourse around the film is relevant and should be incorporated. But I don't know, if you're like a daily, weekly deadline critic, just evaluating a film as it comes out, maybe you don't want to read. I mean, I think when I was doing that, I probably didn't read much, but now most of what I write tends to be after the fact, and I am curious in how a film was received.
So after this series at BAM, what was the kind of next phase in your programming journey?
Florence and I did that for several years, and it was quite gratifying because I think those films, really. I remember another filmmaker we brought, and these are filmmakers who remain really important to me. Alan Girardi was another one. We actually showed his films and actually brought him like for his first screenings in New York. I left The Voice in, I guess, 2006, and did a bunch of things. I freelanced for The Times. There was a period for several years where I was writing for The Times almost every week. And this was a pretty, I think a good moment, relatively speaking, to be writing for that particular publication. I had a fair bit of freedom. I had an editor who basically was just asked me I was basically tasked with just writing about things nobody else would want to write about, or just come up with ideas that had to do with obscure films, foreign films, independent films. I think my first piece for them was about Andrzej Bujalski.
Yeah, I went back and
very early in his career, and then I think I wrote another piece on Kelly Reichardt, and then I don't know. I just eventually realized that I could kind of convince them to I pitched them a piece on Jacques Rivet's Out One is showing in London. I would like to go and see it and write about it because it hasn't shown in, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years. And they were like, sure, which would not happen today. So this was a particular, just window of time where things like that seemed possible. And it was kind of fun. I'll actually say that writing for The Times was kind of good practice for programming for a general audience in a way, to be able to articulate what made these films that may not be familiar to a general audience. Like, how do you contextualize them? How do you write about them? How do you make them sound interesting? So yeah, I was doing that. I also worked for the Museum of the Moving Image for a while as their editorial director. And then the Flaherty, two things happened, I guess. In 2009, Richard Pena invited me to be on the committee of the New York Film Festival. And in 2010, I programmed the Flaherty Seminar. So that was, I guess, that happened around the same time.
Right. The Flaherty Seminar, of course, for those who don't know, a yearly convergence of filmmakers and academics working in the nonfiction space, where a guest curator each edition chooses a set of filmmakers who nobody knows about in advance. It's all about the non-preconception, and during which a lot of intense watching, intense dialogue, and usually some kind of controversy emerges. So what was your experience the year of your Flaherty?
I think you summed it up pretty well, I think. I'm pretty happy with the filmmakers and artists who came to my Flaherty. I programmed it around the theme of work, and my featured filmmakers were Lisandro Alonso, Michael Glavauger, a couple of interesting artists who I think are still doing really interesting work, Lucy Raven and Mika Rottenberg, who I think are more known in the gallery space these days. A couple of young Mexican filmmakers, Pedro Gonzalez Rubio and the late Eugenio Polgovsky, Aruma Owusu, really interesting, experimental filmmaker. Not all my filmmakers were terribly articulate, let's say. So I don't know that the conversations went nearly as well as they could have.
And the programmers are not allowed to speak at the Flaherty. Was that the case then too?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I didn't. Yeah.
When I went, they had to sit there silently as people tore each other apart.
There was actually a rule?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think I was called upon to explain certain choices, which I refused to do.
Maybe you caused them to make the rule. But that's interesting. That theme of work is something I think you've maintained an interest to. It makes me think of your recent essay on Anora for Criterion. But can you talk about your association with the Museum of Moving Image developed when you started this film festival? And I guess that's along with the New York Film Festival, the beginning of your film festival.
Yeah,
career.
I don't remember what year we started First Look, actually, 2010 or 11, something. I was working mostly as doing editorial work for the museum. They were trying to launch a website of criticism. I helped them get it off the ground.
Reverse shot.
It was not Reverse Shot. It was called Moving Image Source.
Oh, okay.
And then it became Reverse. And then, Michael, it's a long, convoluted story. There's still some interesting pieces that we published that are still available. I don't know. I think they're still there because I just came across something. And I think it was about, much like the programming that I did with Florence at BAM or the writing I was doing for the Times. It was just about responding to what were people not doing, what films were not being shown. And I think that's always, I think film programming is site specific, and you have to understand the context in which you're programming. And it seemed like a lot of films were slipping through the cracks. I remember that it seemed like there was room for another festival. And I think I did it with Rachel Rakes for the most part, and then David Schwartz, who was the chief curator at the time, also worked with us. Did we start, I think the first year, did we start with the Ackerman film, Almayer's Folly?
I think so,
I think that was the very first film we showed, and it was just crazy. I mean, that film is, for that film to not be selected anywhere else and for it to be available. It seemed like there was a real need for another festival. I mean, you can speak to this. You created Prismatic Ground as a kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about the fact that there are always gaps, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are as many programmers and cinemas and festivals as you have in the city. There's so many movies being made, and whether it's because of taste at a present time or because of sheer volume, there's always going to be stuff worth seeing that kind of flies by.
Yeah, I mean, I was I think really happy with the few years that I did it with Rachel. We showed filmmakers who I think still fall through the cracks. Like we showed Nico Pereira's films, showed an early film by Gabriel Abrantes and Daniel Schmidt. Yeah, and just things that weren't. And there was quite a lot of programming happening. These were films that were not being selected by new directors, new films, which I wasn't involved with at the time yet. Yeah.
And something I mentioned I wanted to ask you about, is one thing that happens in kind of the shift from criticism to programming is you're not really interacting with filmmakers when you're a critic. In fact, it almost feels somewhat taboo when you're interviewing them, sure, but then there's a different relationship that forms sort of as a programmer. And I'm wondering how that affected your approach to the work, and if, as a critic, you began to think more about filmmakers' intentions through interacting with them, or if that way that relationship changed had any effect kind of on the way you approach either role.
Yeah, I think it's definitely hard. I don't think it's possible to really do both, fully. I think the criticism I do now is just about like, it's not the kind of, I'm not weighing in on like, the releases of the moment. And I just think that would be impossible as a programmer. But I think for me to write about a film that's several years old, or a body of work, I think is fine. But yeah, I do think the relationships with filmmakers can get they can get complicated. I mean, I don't know if I need to elaborate.
Do you remember a filmmaker you were excited to be able to interact with early on, or?
I don't know. I mean, there's always been some filmmakers I'm keen to hear, I'm just keen to hear them talk about their work. But it is interesting, the filmmakers I actually ended up writing at length about, like David Lynch and Sang-soo, are completely inarticulate about their work and like completely opaque and refuse to speak about their work. But that obviously is not the case with many filmmakers who I think are really, really can be quite, brilliant and interesting.
And I think it's worth talking about Lynch for a moment, who you also wrote a book about, Man from Another Place, and who you wrote a lovely tribute to recently for Film Comment after he passed away. What inspired you to dig into his work at length? Was it partly this fact of him being somewhat of an enigma and wanting to unpack that?
Yeah, I think for me, both Hong and Lynch, it's just this idea of going into the project, seeming that, knowing that they were really rich. It would be rich material. Lynch seems to me, even now, I think, inexhaustible. I think the criticism that I like and that I try to practice is the kind that brings the work to life or keeps it alive somehow. I feel like some people, there's a certain kind of writing that tries to pin something down and to just seal it off and explain it away or something. And I think Lynch, it just didn't seem possible with Lynch to do that. He was also, I think, back to like formative years. I mean, as somebody, I think, growing up in the 80s, like watching Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks, like were really formative, important, and experiences for me. And yeah, I think Lynch. Again, as I said with Hong, it just seemed like there would be a lot of possible frameworks suggested. And I think I also like that kind of criticism where I can bring just different contexts and frameworks to bear on a subject, and not treat them as mutually exclusive. And Lynch seemed to be a great fit for that.
To get back to the New York Film Festival, can you talk a little bit about the trajectory and the changes that happened from the time you began? Because there were a lot of them, I think.
Yeah, I mean, when the year 2000, in 2009, when this film was in the festival, the festival took place entirely in Alice Tully Hall, which is our big venue. And there would be a retrospective that took place at the Walter Reed Theater, and that was it. That was the extent of it. So fewer films, and Lincoln Center opened the year-round cinema, the Eleanor Bunin Monroe, in 2011. So that expanded to four screens. So I've had like different phases of working at the festival. I mean, I was on Richard Peña's selection committee, and then I started working there full time in 2013 as a director of year-round programming when Kent Jones was the festival director, and so worked closely with Kent on that. And it was a different configuration of people at the time too. And then 2020 was the first year where I was actually able to, I guess, streamline, restructure the program. And I thought that, it just needed to be, I don't know, I mean, more legible, and also to have room for different types of cinema. I think I understand the need for a festival of our size to show popular films that will attract a large audience, and I think there are many great films that fall into that category every year. But also making room for films that really would not otherwise get that kind of platform, and that's still really important for me. I mean, whether it's like a smaller film that we put in the main slate, or the current section, which I think is full of work that really, I think, benefits from having just the spotlight of the New York Film Festival.
And I think Currents is like an extraordinarily kind of defined section that, as you've said, often contains a lot of the best work of the year, but that is maybe less likely to find larger audiences. Can you talk about how that kind of found its shape? And there was a sort of precursor, in a sense, which was Views from the Avant-Garde.
Mm-hmm. It started as Views from the Avant-Garde,
Right.
Which did exist, I think, even even in the 2000s, and I think that was a lot of great work would show there. But it was also, I think, a quite circumscribed idea of experimental cinema, quite self-contained, I think, to a certain world, and we. Sort of that evolved into Projections, which was a smallish, very small section where we tried to, include work that was maybe narrative and maybe documentary or hybrid, and that would, expand beyond what would be shown in Views from the Avant-Garde. And I think Currents is just, for me, about expanding just the definition of what constitutes, experimentation or an adventurous film. If something doesn't fit in the main slate, it could go in Currents. To be honest, like watching Raya's film today, I was like, that probably would be a Currents. I would probably have put that film in Currents, but obviously we didn't have that at the time. So, and I'm actually not sure that this film, putting it in Alice Tully Hall, was the best thing for the film. But there was no other option.
Do you have a kind of guiding ethos when you're, talking to your selection committee at the beginning of the season? What are you reminding them about what you're trying to achieve together?
We do have those kinds of conversations. I do think that they come more like as we go, just we do have a kind of post-mortem after the fact to think about like what I mean, I think we miss films every year. I think it's okay to admit that we're fallible, we're human.
Kind of impossible not to, right?
Yeah, and also I think it's also, I think it's absurd to think that one has a fixed response to a film, or that Also, viewing conditions are really far from ideal when you're programming on deadline and with the volume of films. There are just periods of time where I'm watching films for more than 12 hours a day, and it just doesn't. I actually don't trust any programmer who says they trust themselves at that point, they're lying. It's just not possible. So I think just looking back and seeing what we could have done differently, and we don't agree. by any means, but I think that's useful.
Can you talk a bit about some of the films you're excited about from this year's slate?
Sure.
Festivals coming up.
I mean, from, in the main slate, I love Jim Jarmusch's film. Jim is somebody his films have always meant a lot to me, but I think this is kind of, just this older, wiser version of Jim Jarmusch that I find really moving. And I think he's kind of a true humanist filmmaker, and I think this film really bears that out. I think, I'm excited about the films that probably maybe run the risk of going under the radar more. Like Ulrich Kohler's film Gavagai, which we are world premiering, is, I think, a really sharp, really smart film about all kinds of prickly things like race and class, but done in a fairly light and funny way. I'm glad that we have a few filmmakers who've never been in the festival before. Francesco Sosai is a young Italian filmmaker who made a film called The Last One for the Road. Milagros Mumenthaler, an Argentinian Swiss filmmaker who has, I think, her best film yet called The Currents. And in the current section, Alexander Koberitz's film Dry Leaf is one of my favorites of the year. I think just a really, it's a film, his follow-up to What Do We See When We Look at the Sky, and it's a film that's shot on a Sony Ericsson cell phone. And I think, it's really interesting what he does with image, with sound, with time in this film.
And then an extraordinary revival section as well, which is the part of the festival that shows restored
Yeah, that's the tricky
films.
section to put together. I mean, because it's relatively small, but we also just want to. Also, we rethought. We used to just show. We used to do a retrospective, which we don't do anymore because the rest of the year, I think they do great programming at FLC. But we've also just sort of. I think what we keep in mind when we put revivals together is films that really have been out of circulation. And many of the films, as a rule, these are films that I had never seen for the most part. Almost all of them were new to me this year. So I think that's a pretty good guideline, that we're showing films that really should be part of the, back in circulation and part of the conversation again.
You're showing Cholet and Alice Tully.
We're showing Cholet and Alice Tully Hall,
exciting.
which is which we don't often do for revivals. And I think that film obviously is very, very well known to some audiences, but I think will be an amazing discovery for many others.
There are aspects of your career we haven't talked about, the year-round programming at Lincoln Center, and the teaching you do, but I'm also cognizant of time, and I want to let folks from the audience, if they have any questions, get some in. So if you have anything, feel free to just throw your hand up. And then if you just give me a moment to repeat it into the mic. And if not, like I said, there are other questions that I have for Dennis. But at the back there. Eureka. So we'll talk a little bit about it before that film, but how come you chose Eureka?
I think, we talked a bit about this. I wanted to show a long film because I'm interested in duration as a viewer and as a programmer.
Right, as I am. Yeah, you were like, maybe that's not the right thing to do in this scenario. I'm like, absolutely it is.
No, I think when I was coming up with films, Asian films that were important to me, I kept thinking of films like Platform, An Elephant Sitting Still, Happy Hour, Wang Bing's films, and Eureka. And I was like, and I do think duration is interesting. I think we'll talk more about it at the 6 o'clock screening, but I think, I don't know, it's fairly obvious. Cinema's about time. And I do think it's a challenge to program a long film. And I do think that something happens when you're watching a long film in a cinema. and I'm interested in what happens. I also don't remember the particulars of this film very well, but I remember the just emotional experience of watching this film. And yeah, because it seems like a film that's really overdue for, it's a film that I think people regard very highly, but also doesn't show very much too.
Yeah, I mean, it can be challenging to program long films, but you really don't shy away from it. I mean, last year at New York Film Festival, there was the 14-hour film about Documenta. There was Julia Lochtov's film, which is playing at Film Forum now.
Yeah.
And these are, rewarding experiences.
Yeah, I mean, Exurg, the film you mentioned, and we show Wang Bing's films regularly. We showed Steve McQueen's Occupied City, and so I think there's, I do think there's something that happens. And we showed La Flor, Trenke Lauken as well. So I think it's interesting when I think watching the film and the experience of watching the film becomes so critical.
Other questions or thoughts over here? And then we'll go up there. Yeah. Right. So what, if not Alice Tully Hall, what would the ideal scenario for this film be? I think you mentioned currents, and maybe, how do you make these decisions?
I think I would probably put it in a smaller house, something around this size, 200 or so seats, which is what we do for the films in Currents, which I think are maybe a bit, more, challenging for some audiences, you could say. But I actually don't remember what happened. I don't think I hosted that screening, so I don't remember how it was received at all.
Every year it seems like, maybe there's one or two films that could have gone main slate or Currents, and I'm curious about how those choices are made. Something like De Humani Corporis Fabrica. I think it was a bold choice to put that in main slate.
Sometimes the filmmakers insist. But I don't know. I think there's all kinds of reasons.
Right,
to,
of course.
I think it's just the balance of the sections overall.
Yeah.
Like this year, Dry Leaf, I think we could have possibly put it in the main slate. I mean, we put his previous film there. Last year, there were a couple of films like Viet and Nam, Trong Minh Quye's film, which I think could have gone in Currents, but we decided to put it in the main slate. Yeah.
But is that part of that is a question about audience, right? Like
the potential. I mean, the potential size of an audience.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Sure. I think that's always a bit of a guess too.
Right.
Yeah.
There was someone up there. Yeah. The question is about showing films like Independencia that carry this kind of political context and history, showing those to an American audience or otherwise one that may not catch that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think this is also why festivals are important, where a filmmaker is there to speak a little bit about it. I don't know if this film in particular is so. I think obviously it deals with the colonial history of the Philippines, but it's quite a simple film, I think it's almost crude in its simplicity, which is kind of what I like about it. I think this is part of the work of curation, whether it's in the form of like program notes or introductions or just creating a discursive space around a film. I think that's sort of our job as programmers. But I will say about this film, I was just thinking about it as I was watching it. One thing I really responded to, I guess, when I saw the film and again today is just like the extravagant artifice of it. I mean, I think that's also one thing I'm drawn to is just the films that do not feel the need to go along with the rules of realism, which I think are so dominant in cinema, and especially in a certain kind of like world cinema, global cinema, where you're expected to represent things a certain way. And I just love the moviness and the fakeness of this film. It's actually lovelier than I remembered, like just really as a visual experience and the sound too.
Yeah, and the artifice kind of making it also about cinema in some way and about the very representation of
film history and national history. And I do think, also I was thinking about how certain things, I don't remember if I was thinking this at the time too, but the fact that this film is kind of obviously made in the style of like a primitive, almost like kind of cheap, like soundstage movie, like, but through very like basic means, like just with the painted backdrops and all of that. Yeah, I think it's also, I remember talking about this with Raya at the time, that the Philippines did not have a film archive at the time this film was made. And even though films were made in I guess the setting of this film would have been the American occupation, so it probably would have been in the 30s, 20s, 30s. That even though the Philippines and the films were being made, they no longer exist. They didn't survive for the most part. So this is a film that's made in response to a missing archive. And I think that's also really interesting to think about. That a film he made before this, called a short film about the Indio Nacional, was also like using the language of silent cinema and set during the end of the Spanish colonial period, so like the late 19th century. And yeah, I think those ideas that maybe like a little more like have a little more currency right now, like just because thanks to writers like Saidiya Hartman, but the idea of like just the film as a response to an absence of images.
Others? Yeah, sorry. Have you ever had to really fight for a film to be included in a program or in a festival lineup? And
yes.
Do any particular instances come to mind?
Well, I mean, this one was one that I don't know was like necessarily beloved by all. But this year wasn't that tricky. I mean, I've been on the committee there have been different configurations of people, some of whom I'm more aligned with. Look, it's a little different now because I've put the selection committees together, and they're people I tend to be aligned with. It's not we don't agree by any means, but I think we're at least all speaking the same language. But I have been on, not even just the New York Film Festival Selection Committee, I've been on juries and all kinds of panels where people you feel like you're just not speaking the same language. And that has happened in the course of the New York Film Festival. I feel like there have been films I've fought for and not been able to get in.
Can you name one of those?
Bertrand Bonello's Nocturama.
Oh, I love that movie.
I really fought for that film, and like that was a big regret for me, not being able to sway.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary movie. Over here? The question was with regards, you talked about being from Malaysia, and so thinking about that region of the world, the way it's been underrepresented in terms of programming and cinema. So how do you go about filling these kinds of gaps, and what is that process like? Does that bring anything to mind for you?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's a big question. I'm not sure it's something that anyone, in film program can really address when you're talking about that kind of. But I also think that this period, the 2000s, was a really robust and I think exciting time for the region. And you think of Apichatpong obviously being the figure who almost overshadows everything, but there were interesting films coming out of Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and to a lesser degree also Malaysia and Singapore and other countries. And recent films, I think in recent years, there's been activity in Cambodia and Vietnam. I think, sure, I mean, I think it doesn't fit with every single institution or programmer, but if that's your interest, then I think, there's a lot there. I mean, it's not like the work isn't there. I think from the 2000s, there's just an incredible, just the activity that was happening. And I think it's an underexplored period, an underexplored time. I'm not even sure whether the filmmakers were influencing one another, or if they was fairly contained. And also, it didn't last, like all these movements. It didn't last. A lot of them went on to do like paying work because they needed to, like, I don't know, be adults and make money and work for Netflix, or, so that was a particular moment in time. And I think there have been, just different parts of the region have had different, growing pains and ebbs and flows.
To touch on your work as the year-round director of programming at Lincoln Center, which was from like 2013 to 2022. One program you did that was really important for me, kind of when I had just gotten to the city, was this Gothic retrospective. That seems like an instance in which it might have been a little harder to find materials and particularly good copies of things. And
yeah, I mean, you often come in. I think that was like kind of that was like the biggest like sort of learning curve for me, like doing year-round programming and figuring out like how to find the detective work of that. And just, I remember the first program that I did, like not entirely by myself because we're lucky to always have a team, but like I decided to do like a complete George Cukor retrospective, and he made 50 films. So that was like kind of just good, on the job training. We got to find all of them. And then it's just about like figuring out a network of contacts and writing to people who can help.
Anyone else? I just want to ask a couple more things, and then we can wrap it up. One, again, just to extend the thought about that year-round programming. Can you say more about what that was like and strategizing? I think your first program as year-round programmer at Lincoln Center was this Cinema of Rebellion thing where you played the case against Lincoln Center, which was a nice move, I think. But what was that learning curve you speak of like, and how did you come to conceive of programs and build?
Yeah, that was interesting. I mean, in a place like Lincoln Center, this kind of institution, you step in and you've inherited a bunch of things that are just on the calendar that you kind of have to fulfill anyway. And then I think figuring out the team you want to work with and the kind of programming, and also I think it was possibly, definitely, I think a less robust time for repertory movie going in the city. It felt like we really did have to cultivate audiences. Richard Pena, who did it before me, had, I think those were important programs for that time. Did a lot of national cinema retrospectives. A lot of great work came to New York that way, but I thought those were outmoded, and spent the first couple of years actually like getting rid of some of them. And yeah, you mentioned the Cinema of Resistance program. I actually co-programmed it with John Gianvito, who had made this omnibus film, Far From Afghanistan, at the time. And it seemed like a nice way to just test the waters to see what you could get away with. And nobody, I don't know if they even noticed that I showed the case against Lincoln Center. So.
The other one thing I want to ask before we wrap up is just about your teaching. You taught at Harvard for several years. You're teaching at Columbia right now, and carrying forth what you've learned. One thing I'm curious in particular is this class you teach called Deaths of Cinema, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and tie it into kind of where you think we're at right now in terms of the vitality of the form.
Yeah, I'm teaching it right now at Columbia, and I've taught it before in Harvard. And it's just a couple of years ago, actually, at Harvard. And I guess it just relates to this recurring narrative that cinema is dying. It's something that comes up all the time. It's something that I've faced in my entire working life. And of course, if you actually go back and look at it, historically, it has existed from the very beginning of the medium. So I think the discourse as it currently exists isn't terribly useful. So I was kind of interested in complicating it, in trying to understand what these previous moments of death, or what were changes that were experienced as death, what they might tell us about the current moment of decline, this extinction panic that we're currently going through? Does the transition from silent to sound, or the emergence of television, can we learn anything from those moments? And also to think about, to just reframe our understanding of death as, what if cinema's death isn't something that is looming, and always on the horizon, and always to be avoided or deflected in some way. But what if the death has happened many times? What if the death is plural and recurring and already underway? So I think it's just a little bit of a thought experiment that helps me kind of like contend with, because I think I've said this like before. I as somebody who's worked in print media and film exhibition, film festivals, you get told often, like film criticism, that these fields are facing extinction. They're dying fields. I think we all hear this, and so what do you do with that rhetoric? Like, what's true about it and what isn't? And so I think in a way the class it's just a history of cinema, but looked at through the moments of its supposed deaths. So.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. We're gonna present Eureka at 6 o'clock. I think that'll be a great experience. I'm excited. So if you're able to, come back. The New York Film Festival lineup is out, and it's great. I think tickets go on sale soon, right?
I think Thursday, yeah.
Thursday. And a huge thank you to Dennis.
Thanks so much
here.
Thank you.